In the spring of 1862, Abraham Lincoln had what he believed was the clearest path to ending the Civil War that the Union would ever get. George McClellan had positioned 100,000 soldiers on the Virginia Peninsula and was closing on Richmond. Irvin McDowell's corps of 40,000 men sat at Fredericksburg, 40 miles north of the Confederate capital, waiting for the order to march south and join him. Together, they would have outnumbered every Confederate soldier in Virginia so severely that Robert E. Lee himself later acknowledged the situation would have been nearly impossible to reverse. Jefferson Davis was sending his family out of Richmond. Confederate government clerks were burning official documents in the street. Lincoln believed the war could be over before summer ended. Then 17,000 Confederate soldiers did something in a mountain valley 60 miles to the west that changed all of it. For 48 days in the spring of 1862, Stonewall Jackson ran through the Shenandoah Valley in a way the Union Army could not explain and could not stop. He covered more than 350 miles. He fought 5 pitched battles against 3 separate Union forces and won 4 of them outright. He moved his infantry at speeds that made experienced Federal officers disbelieve their own scouts. His men crossed from one end of the valley to the other and back again, while 3 Union armies tried to pin them down and caught nothing. When it was over, Jackson had not captured a single strategically significant city. He had not destroyed a meaningful portion of the Union Army. He had not done anything that, drawn on a map, looked like a historic military achievement. What he had done was make Abraham Lincoln so afraid of losing Washington that the President personally ordered McDowell's 40,000 men away from McClellan's campaign and pointed them at a Confederate threat that was never real enough to materialize. That decision, made in near panic on May 24, 1862, ended any realistic possibility of the Peninsula Campaign succeeding that year. It turned on the actions of one man with 17,000 soldiers and a valley he understood better than anyone sent to fight him in it. This is the story of how the Shenandoah Valley Campaign of 1862 became one of the most tactically audacious and strategically consequential operations in the history of the American Civil War, and how a man who sucked on lemons, fell asleep during conversations, and kept his military plans so secret that his own officers didn't know their destination until they were almost there, turned a mountain valley into the thing that saved Richmond. The Shenandoah Valley stretches roughly 150 miles from the Potomac River southwest into the Virginia interior, pinched between the Blue Ridge Mountains on the east and the Allegheny Range on the west. It was the most productive agricultural corridor in Virginia in 1862. Breadbasket, cattle country, orchard land, and geography had made it into something that armies valued beyond its crops. An army moving northeast through the valley could threaten Washington, Baltimore, or the rail lines feeding the northern states without being easily intercepted. An army moving southwest could push deep into the Confederate interior. The valley was a blade that pointed in both directions simultaneously, and whoever held it controlled a strategic option the other side could not safely ignore. The Massanutten Mountain deserves particular attention because it was the geographic engine of everything Jackson did between mid-May and early June. The mountain was not particularly tall, around 2,000 feet at its highest points, but its north-south orientation down the center of the valley meant that an army on one side of it could not directly observe an army on the other side of it. The single pass at New Market was the only crossing point for miles in either direction. When Jackson moved his force east through that pass on May 22nd in preparation for the Front Royal assault, he effectively disappeared from Banks's view. Banks could no longer determine whether Jackson was moving north through the west sub-valley toward Strasburg, east through the pass toward Front Royal, or somewhere else entirely. Uncertainty about Jackson's location was almost as strategically valuable as certainty about Banks's location, and the Massanutten provided that uncertainty on demand. That strategic reality was what made the Valley critical to the Confederate High Command in the spring of 1862. Richmond was the crisis. McClellan's advance up the peninsula was slow and methodical, but it was steady, and by May his army was close enough to the Confederate capital that church bells could be heard from the front lines on quiet mornings. Lee, then serving as Jefferson Davis's military advisor rather than a field commander, grasped the situation with a clarity that few people around him shared. The Confederacy could not win a war of pure numbers. It did not have the men or the industrial capacity to fight the Union across the full breadth of the conflict on equal terms. What it had was the ability to use geography, speed, and the specific vulnerabilities of the opposing command structure to make Union numerical superiority temporarily irrelevant. The Valley was the instrument for that approach, and the man already stationed in it was the instrument for everything else. Thomas Jonathan Jackson had been assigned to the Shenandoah District in the fall of 1861 after First Bull Run gave him the name and reputation that would define the rest of his brief life. Before the war, he taught mathematics and artillery tactics at the Virginia Military Institute and was regarded by his students as one of the most ineffective classroom instructors in the school's history. He read his lectures verbatim from prepared notes, and when students asked questions, he simply repeated the relevant section of the lecture word for word. His personal habits struck observers as eccentric in ways that ranged from mildly unusual to genuinely difficult to explain. He sucked lemons with a contemplative intensity that other people found slightly unnerving. He held his right hand raised above his head at odd moments, having concluded, on the basis of a medical theory he alone subscribed to, that this posture kept his blood in proper balance. He fell asleep at dinner tables. He fell asleep in church, which embarrassed his wife. He prayed with a frequency and sincerity that embarrassed subordinates who happened to witness it. He imposed operational secrecy on his own brigade commanders with a rigidity that sometimes left them marching a full day with no idea where they were going or why. The secrecy that defined how Jackson led was not eccentricity for its own sake. It was strategic discipline applied to his own command structure. Jackson understood that any subordinate who knew the destination or the operational intent of a march was a subordinate who might be captured, whose staff might be overheard, whose letters home might mention something that found its way to the wrong reader. He operated on the assumption that his plans were secure only as long as they existed in no mind but his own. Ewell, who commanded one of his divisions, once remarked in exasperation that no one could tell him anything about Jackson's intentions, because Jackson himself apparently hadn't told Jackson. The men who served under him learned to read the pace and the direction of the march rather than asking questions, because the questions produced nothing. They marched where the march went and fought when they arrived at the place where fighting was the thing to do. His men called him Old Jack, and they would eventually follow him into assaults they knew in advance would cost them severely, because Old Jack had a way of being right about things that wasn't entirely possible to explain before they happened. That trust was not given freely. It was built, march by march and fight by fight, across the weeks of the Valley Campaign. The campaign's opening looked, by conventional military accounting, like a Confederate defeat. On March 23, 1862, at Kernstown in the Northern Valley, Jackson attacked a Union force under Nathan Kimball that his cavalry scouts had told him was smaller than it actually was. The scouts were wrong. Kimball had roughly 9,000 men. Jackson's division numbered around 4,000. The assault was repulsed after an afternoon of hard fighting in which Kimball's superior numbers finally bent Jackson's brigades backward and forced a retreat south through Winchester. Northern newspapers reported a Union victory and printed Kimball's name in favorable terms. By the standard measure of battle outcomes, who held the field and who retreated, they were not wrong. The strategic consequences of Kernstown bore no relationship to the tactical outcome. Before March 23rd, Lincoln and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton had already begun the process of releasing McDowell's corps from Washington's defensive perimeter and sending it south to reinforce McClellan. The orders were in preparation. McDowell was making preliminary movements. McClellan had built his operational planning around McDowell's eventual arrival on the peninsula. Kernstown changed Lincoln's entire calculation. If Jackson, who had a reputation after Bull Run as an aggressive and unpredictable commander willing to fight when other Confederate officers hesitated, was attacking with what appeared to be a significant force in the Shenandoah, what Confederate force was actually in the valley? Where was the rest of it? If Union intelligence had been wrong about Jackson's strength at Kernstown, it might be wrong about the full picture. And if there were more Confederate soldiers in the valley than anyone had assessed, what prevented them from moving north toward Washington the moment McDowell's corps marched south? Lincoln pulled McDowell back. He also ordered Nathaniel Banks, who commanded the Union force screening the northern valley, to remain there rather than following his original orders to join the Peninsula operation. A battle Jackson lost generated a strategic result that a Jackson victory at Kernstown could not have produced. The general who failed to hold the field gained in the days after his retreat something more valuable than any piece of Virginia ground: 40,000 Union soldiers who would not be going to Richmond. The psychological effect of Kernstown on the Union command extended beyond Lincoln and Stanton. Officers throughout the Army of the Potomac who had been working on the assumption that the Shenandoah was a secondary concern were forced to recalibrate. If Jackson was willing to attack with apparently inferior numbers, what did that imply about his confidence in his own strength? If his confidence was justified, what strength was he actually operating with? The uncertainty generated by an aggressive commanding general willing to attack when he appeared to be outnumbered proved to be operationally valuable in ways that went beyond the specific decision about McDowell's corps. It created a margin of doubt in Union planning that persisted through the Valley Campaign and shaped every assessment of Jackson's intentions throughout those 48 days. Jackson spent the following weeks absorbing reinforcements and preparing what his subordinates would later describe as an operational concept he explained to no one, and that became apparent to the men around him only as it was already being executed. Richard Ewell's division joined him in late April, bringing his total force to roughly 17,000. With Ewell came the capacity to move multiple columns, to threaten from more than one direction simultaneously, to be in two places close enough together that a Union commander couldn't safely respond to either without worrying about the other. The valley itself was Jackson's greatest asset, and he read it the way a man reads terrain he has moved across his entire life. Beyond the Massanutten's concealment properties lay a network of roads, fords, and ridgelines that Jackson had studied before the campaign began, and that his cavalry commander Turner Ashby knew with a native's familiarity. Jackson understood which roads were passable after rain and which turned to traps. He knew where artillery could be positioned on high ground to cover a retreat, and where infantry could be placed to hold a position that looked exposed but was actually defensible. That geographic knowledge was not something McDowell or Fremont or Banks could quickly acquire. They were operating in territory Jackson had already mapped in his mind. In early May, the Army moved west over the Alleghenies to deal with a Union force under John Fremont that had come east from western Virginia. At the town of McDowell on May 8th, Confederate infantry held high ground while Fremont's troops attacked uphill and were repulsed across an afternoon of sustained fighting on steep terrain that exhausted the Union attackers and left the Confederate defensive position intact. The battle secured Jackson's western flank, eliminated any possibility of Fremont linking up with Banks in the main valley corridor before Jackson was ready to be found, and freed the Confederate Army to turn its full attention north. Then Jackson turned north. What followed became a textbook that professional military officers have studied in detail ever since. Jackson shifted his forces east through the Massanutten Pass, while Turner Ashby's Confederate cavalry screened the movement with such effectiveness that Banks, sitting at Strasburg in the Northern Valley, could not get reliable intelligence about where Jackson was, what direction he was moving, or how large his force had grown. The intelligence blackout was not accidental. Ashby ran his cavalry operations with an aggressiveness and geographic fluency that made Union scouting nearly impossible for days at a time. Federal cavalry patrols that ventured south of Banks's position encountered Confederate horsemen who turned them back before they could observe anything worth reporting. Banks was, operationally, blind. On May 23rd, Jackson's column came out of the Massanutten and struck the Union garrison at Front Royal from a direction and with a force that Banks's intelligence had given him no reason to anticipate. The garrison of roughly 1,000 men was overwhelmed before it could organize a coherent defense. The telegraph operator sent a fragmentary warning north, and then the line went dead mid-sentence. The cavalry detachment assigned to defend Front Royal was ridden down before it could escape to carry news of what was happening. The town fell in hours. Banks at Strasburg received scattered reports suggesting trouble on his right flank, but couldn't assemble a clear picture. By the time he understood the scale of what had happened, Jackson was already moving northwest to cut the road between Strasburg and Winchester and sever Banks's line of retreat. The chase north through the valley that followed covered roughly 40 miles in under 2 days. Banks retreated toward Winchester, abandoning supply wagons and equipment along the road to keep moving at a pace his men could barely sustain. Jackson pressed from the east and south with a column that was itself exhausted but hadn't been given permission to slow down. Confederate cavalry ranged ahead of the infantry, trying to get between Banks and Winchester before Banks arrived. They nearly succeeded. The race was closer than the outcome suggests. At Winchester on May 25th, Confederate forces struck Banks's hastily assembled defensive line outside the town and broke it in the morning's fighting. Union troops retreated through Winchester itself in a retreat that became disorganized in its final miles, soldiers throwing down equipment to move faster as Confederate infantry pressed their rear and artillery rounds landed among the retreating columns. Banks got his army across the Potomac into Maryland, but the valley from Winchester north was in Confederate hands, and Banks's force was in no condition to fight for days. The road north from Winchester to the Potomac was scattered with the debris of Banks's retreat for 20 miles. Soldiers had thrown away packs, ammunition boxes, extra equipment, anything that added weight in the final scramble to the river. Union supply wagons had been abandoned along the route. Confederate cavalry collecting what Banks left behind found quantities of food, ammunition, and medical stores that Jackson's quartermaster described as a meaningful supplement to the Confederate supply situation in the valley. The men who had been short of rations for weeks ate from Union supplies while their officers compiled the capture manifests. A retreating Army's leavings told exactly how badly the retreat had gone. News of what had happened reached Washington in pieces across May 24th and 25th, each piece worse than the last. Lincoln was already under pressure from Congress and from an increasingly impatient Northern press about the slow pace of Peninsula operations. The casualty lists from 5 weeks of fighting in the Tidewater country of Virginia had been filling newspapers for weeks, and the mood in Washington was one of anxious frustration. Now Banks was across the Potomac with Jackson's army behind him and the northern Shenandoah Valley open. The possibility that Confederate forces could press north and threaten Washington, Baltimore, or the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad felt in those 2 days entirely immediate. Lincoln's response was intense and personally engaged in ways that were unusual even for a president who involved himself deeply in military affairs. He and Stanton sent telegrams in multiple directions simultaneously, to McDowell, to Fremont, to state governors about militia availability, to railroad officials about troop movement capacity. Lincoln drafted operational messages specifying march distances, timing windows, and rendezvous points with a precision that reflected genuine engagement with the military geometry of the problem rather than simple political alarm. He was attempting to coordinate a three-army envelopment from Washington, using incomplete information that was hours or days old by the time it reached him, against a commander who was moving faster than the telegraph could reliably track. The plan was operationally sound in outline. Fremont would push east from the mountains. McDowell would redirect his corps west from Fredericksburg. Together, they would position Union forces at the southern end of the valley before Jackson could retreat through it, cutting his escape route while Banks recovered and followed from the north. Trap it, close it, destroy it. The McDowell telegram went out on May 24th. 40,000 soldiers who had been preparing to march south toward Richmond were ordered west toward the Shenandoah instead. McClellan received word within hours and wrote back to Washington arguing that the Valley threat was a deliberate Confederate feint designed to divert Union forces from the peninsula, and that the correct response was to press harder on Richmond rather than redirect strength toward a secondary operation. He was exactly right about the nature of the threat. Jackson's operation was precisely the feint McClellan described. Lincoln, facing a Congress and a public that would not forgive him if Washington fell, did not have the political latitude to accept that assessment regardless of its accuracy. McDowell would not be going to the peninsula. Jackson's soldiers left accounts of those weeks that share a specific quality, a matter-of-fact tone when describing conditions that by any reasonable standard were extraordinary. Soldiers in their letters home mentioned 20-mile marches the way a man mentions a long day at work as something that happened and needed to be mentioned before moving on to other subjects. They wrote about their feet universally. The roads through the valley in the wet spring of 1862 were mud and stone in alternation, and the footwear the Confederate supply system provided was inadequate to sustained hard marching. Men wrapped their feet in rags cut from clothing. Some marched portions of the campaign barefoot on roads that cut them. Jackson's straggler problem, which he documented carefully in his after-action reports, was substantially a foot problem. The men who fell out were often men whose feet had simply given out before the rest of them did. The operational failure of the three-army pursuit was partly a problem of geometry and partly a problem of institutional limitations that no amount of presidential urgency could overcome. Fremont's force had to move east over mountain roads that were poor in good weather and punishing in the intermittent rain of the Virginia spring. McDowell's corps, which Lincoln had redirected west, faced the challenge of a march across terrain between Fredericksburg and the valley that added days to any movement calculation. Banks, whose force was still recovering from the retreat across the Potomac, was not in a position to press aggressively south, regardless of what Washington ordered. Lincoln was asking three armies to coordinate a rendezvous at the southern end of the valley using march rates and road conditions that his operational telegrams assumed were more favorable than they were. Jackson, moving south with knowledge of every road in the valley and with Ashby's cavalry buying time at his rear, was always going to reach Port Republic before the trap could close. The geometry was never in Lincoln's favor. Jackson understood his position with clarity the moment Banks crossed the Potomac. He had accomplished what the Valley operation was designed to accomplish. McDowell was not going to Richmond. The pressure on the Confederate capital had been partially relieved. Remaining in the northern valley now invited the destruction Lincoln was organizing. Jackson began pulling south. The retreat up the valley became another demonstration of what his army could do under sustained pressure. The foot cavalry moved at paces that kept Union pursuers consistently behind, despite their numerical advantage. The men were exhausted in ways that showed in their letters home and in their straggler rolls, which Jackson tracked with the same attentiveness he gave casualty figures. Men who had been marching and fighting for weeks reached physical limits that discipline alone couldn't always override. But the column kept moving. The core of the force held together and kept the pace, and the pace was what mattered. Ashby's cavalry worked the rear, buying time with rearguard skirmishes that delayed the Union pursuit without accepting a decisive engagement. Ashby was killed on June 6th near Harrisonburg, shot during a cavalry action covering the Confederate withdrawal. His death removed from the campaign its most operationally irreplaceable officer. Ashby knew the valley's roads and fords and ridgelines with an intimacy that no map could reproduce, and his capacity to screen Confederate movements from Union observation had been central to everything Jackson accomplished across the 48-day campaign. Jackson, in his battle report, gave him the most extensive tribute he offered any officer killed during the campaign. For a man not given to elaboration, that report said something. At Port Republic, where the North and South Forks of the Shenandoah joined near the Blue Ridge foothills, Jackson turned and fought both pursuing forces in sequence over 2 days. On June 8th, Ewell's division held Fremont's army at Cross Keys in a defensive engagement fought in open farmland and woodland east of Harrisonburg. Ewell positioned his brigades along a ridge and allowed Fremont to attack against the Confederate defensive advantage, repulsing the Union assaults with losses that left Fremont unwilling to press the attack further. On June 9th, Jackson dealt with a Union column under James Shields at Port Republic in fighting that cost Confederate brigades serious casualties during assaults on Union artillery positions before the Federal line finally broke. Both pursuing forces were stopped. Jackson's army crossed the bridge at Port Republic and burned it behind them, leaving Fremont standing on the north bank, watching timber burn over water he had no means to cross. The three-army envelopment Lincoln had planned and coordinated personally from Washington had caught nothing. Jackson had moved through the closing gap and come out intact on the other side, with his infantry, artillery, and wagon trains essentially preserved. The Union forces in the valley held the same geographic positions they had occupied before the campaign began, and they were available to no other theater of operations. Jackson's army crossed the Blue Ridge and arrived outside Richmond in time for the opening of the 7 days' battles in late June. His performance in those engagements was slower and less decisive than his valley work. The campaign had run the army and its commander to limits that showed in tactical delays Lee's plans couldn't accommodate, but his presence on the battlefield mattered. Lee had the force he needed for the counteroffensive that drove McClellan back from Richmond's edge to Harrison's Landing on the James, ending the Peninsula Campaign's forward momentum permanently. McClellan's army was withdrawn from the peninsula by August. The closest path to Richmond the Union would have in the Eastern Theater was gone. It had been gone since May 24th, when Lincoln signed the order redirecting McDowell. And that order had been signed because 17,000 Confederate soldiers had moved through a Virginia valley fast enough and fought aggressively enough to make the security of Washington feel uncertain at a moment when Lincoln could not afford to be wrong about it. The political dimension of Lincoln's Valley decisions is inseparable from the military one. The President was operating under pressures in May 1862 that would have been severe, even without a military crisis in the Shenandoah. Congressional midterm elections were less than 6 months away. The radical Republicans in Congress were already questioning Lincoln's war management and his commitment to fighting the conflict with full aggression. A Confederate force threatening Washington, or appearing to threaten Washington, would become an immediate political crisis if Lincoln did not respond to it visibly and forcefully. Whether McDowell's corps was actually necessary for Washington's defense was, in a strict military sense, debatable. Whether Lincoln could afford to be seen not defending Washington was not debatable at all. The political vulnerability was real, even when the military threat was not, and Jackson's campaign exploited both simultaneously. The Valley Campaign's place in military history rests on the precision with which it achieved a strategic effect grossly out of proportion to the forces involved. Jackson did not defeat the Union Army in Virginia. He did not take a Union city or destroy Union infrastructure. He moved, fought, moved again, and let 3 Union armies exhaust themselves chasing a force they could never quite corner. His casualties were significant. The campaign cost the Confederacy men it could not easily replace. but the strategic return was substantial beyond any reasonable comparison of losses. The cost of holding McDowell away from the peninsula, measured in what the Peninsula Campaign's failure cost the Union in time and resources and political will, dwarfs any arithmetic of Valley casualties. The military principles Jackson demonstrated, interior lines exploited through speed, geographic intelligence used as a force multiplier, the manipulation of an enemy commander's perception of threat rather than the threat itself, have been studied and restudied in the century and a half since. European armies analyzed the campaign before the First World War. 20th century theorists of mobile warfare found in it a template for what highly motivated, geographically literate infantry could accomplish against numerically superior opponents confined by a rigid command structure. The Valley Campaign became canonical precisely because it demonstrated something that numerical analysis alone cannot capture: that the war inside a commander's head is sometimes more decisive than the war on the ground beneath his feet. What the theoretical literature sometimes underweights is the physical cost to the men who marched it. 350 miles, 5 battles, spring nights cold in the Blue Ridge foothills, irregular supply lines, and a pace of movement that would have been demanding for rested troops, and was genuinely extraordinary for men who had been at it for weeks without meaningful rest. The Shenandoah Valley civilian population helped sustain them across those miles. Food brought to roadsides when the column passed through towns, grain and cattle from farms along the line of march. Information about Union movements shared freely by people who understood that this army was fighting for their country and their homes. The soldiers and the Valley supported each other, and that relationship, ordinary in its individual moments, accumulated to something consequential across hundreds of miles of marching through country that regarded these men as its own. Lincoln stood at the end of it holding 60,000 soldiers in the wrong place. 3 Union armies sat in or adjacent to the Shenandoah Valley, none of them within reach of Richmond, none of them having achieved the decisive result against Jackson that the entire effort had been organized to produce. McDowell's corps, 40,000 strong, the most powerful uncommitted Union force in the Eastern Theater, had not meaningfully engaged the Confederacy in the weeks that mattered most. None of those armies had been stopped by a force of equal or superior size. They had been stopped by 17,000 men, and a general who understood that the war he was actually fighting was for the imagination of a president in Washington who was trying to hold a fractured nation together under pressure that few people in American history have ever faced. In that war, the one fought inside Lincoln's head, and not on the valley floor, Jackson won decisively, with the mountains at his back and the road open in front of him, moving faster than anyone who came to stop him. That is what 17,000 men did to 60,000. Not by meeting them in the open and beating them in fair contest, but by being somewhere unexpected, then somewhere else, then turning to fight when the math allowed and moving again before the trap could close. The Valley Campaign did not end the Civil War, and it did not save the Confederacy permanently. What it did was purchase Richmond the time it needed to survive into a longer war. It purchased that time at a cost the Confederacy could barely afford, bought by a man who sucked on lemons and raised his hand above his head and prayed more than his officers thought was strictly necessary, running his infantry through a mountain valley until the Union Army could not find him, and the President in Washington could not stop thinking about him.